The river had torn through the canyon like a madman's fury, and when Yates Nolan found the woman's body tangled in the cottonwood roots below his cabin, he thought she was already dead. He had been checking his traps along the Snake River that morning in late April of 1878, the mountain snow melting fast and turning the usually placid waters into a churning beast. The sound of the rapids had been thunderous for days, drowning out the usual birdsong and quiet that Yates had come to treasure in his 5 years living alone in these Wyoming mountains. He was a man built for solitude, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk, his dark hair hanging past his collar in waves that he rarely bothered to trim. His hands were calloused and strong, arms thick with muscle from years of splitting wood, hauling game, and surviving in terrain that broke lesser men. When he spotted the pale fabric caught in the debris, his first instinct was to ignore it. Probably just someone's lost laundry from upstream, carried down from one of the mining camps. But something made him look closer, and that's when he saw the hand, small and white, fingers still curled as if grasping for something that wasn't there. Yates moved faster than he had in months, his boots splashing through the shallows as he reached the spot where the current had deposited her. She was face down, her dark hair spread like seaweed across the rocks, wearing what had once been a decent traveling dress now torn and waterlogged. He pulled her free of the roots with careful urgency, turning her over to find a young woman's face, lips blue, skin cold as the mountain water itself. But when he pressed his ear to her chest, he heard it, faint, so faint he almost missed it beneath the roar of the river, a heartbeat. "Come on," he muttered, gathering her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. She was tiny compared to him, and so still that he feared with each step back to his cabin that her heart had given up the fight. Water streamed from her clothes, leaving a trail behind them as he carried her up the slope to his home. The cabin was modest but well built, chinked tight against the mountain winters. He kicked the door open and brought her straight to his bed, the only real bed in the place, laying her on the thick furs and wool blankets. Her lips were turning darker blue, and Yates knew he didn't have much time. He had seen drowning victims before, back in his younger days working the riverboats before he came west. His hands moved with purpose, turning her on her side, pressing firmly on her back between her shoulder blades. Water gushed from her mouth more than seemed possible, and then she choked. It was the most beautiful sound Yates had heard in years. She coughed violently, her whole body convulsing as she purged the river from her lungs. He supported her through it, one large hand steady on her shoulder, the other keeping her head turned so she wouldn't choke. When the coughing finally subsided, she drew in a ragged, gasping breath, and then another. But she didn't wake. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and she was still far too cold. Yates moved into action, his survival instincts taking over. He built up the fire in the stone hearth until it roared, filling the cabin with heat. Then came the hard part. Her clothes had to come off. They were soaked through, stealing what little warmth her body had left. He worked with clinical efficiency, telling himself she was just another creature that needed saving, like the wolf pup he had nursed back to health 2 winters ago, or the hawk with the broken wing. His hands didn't shake as he peeled away the layers of fabric, revealing pale skin marred with bruises and scrapes. He kept his eyes on his task, nothing more, covering her with dry blankets and furs as soon as he had her free of the wet clothing. He hung her dress and undergarments by the fire, then set about making something warm for her to drink when she woke. If she woke. Yates pushed that thought away. She would wake, she had to. He hadn't pulled her from death's grip just to lose her to the cold. All through that first day, he sat beside the bed, checking her breathing, her pulse, the color slowly returning to her skin. He heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, tucking them around her to drive away the chill. When night fell, she still hadn't opened her eyes, but her breathing had grown stronger, more regular. Yates pulled his chair close to the bedside and settled in for a long watch. He had nowhere else to be. The traps could wait. The game could wait. Everything could wait. Something about this woman, this stranger who the river had brought to his doorstep, made him want to fight for her life as fiercely as she was fighting to hold on to it. He must have dozed sometime near dawn, because when he jerked awake, the light was streaming through his small window, and there was movement from the bed. He was on his feet instantly, looking down to find a pair of eyes staring back at him. They were the color of amber, wide with confusion and fear. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much these days, with only himself for company. "You're safe. You nearly drowned in the river. I pulled you out." She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. Her hand moved weakly to her throat. "Don't try to talk yet," Yates told her, reaching for the cup of water he had kept warmed by the fire. "Here, small sips." He helped her rise just enough to drink, supporting her head with one hand while he held the cup to her lips with the other. She drank greedily at first, then choked, and he pulled it away. "Slow," he instructed. "Your throat's raw from the water." She nodded slightly, and he let her have another sip, then another. When she had drunk enough, he eased her back down onto the pillows. She was studying him now, those amber eyes taking in his face, his size, her gaze flickering around the cabin before returning to him. "Where?" she managed, the single word barely more than a whisper. "Snake River Valley, Wyoming Territory," he answered. "About 40 miles north of any real town. I'm Yates Nolan. This is my cabin. You're safe here." Something in his words made her eyes fill with tears, though she didn't let them fall. She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had slipped back into unconsciousness, but then she spoke again. "Rebecca," she whispered. "Rebecca Osborne." "Rebecca," he repeated, and something about saying her name aloud made her reel in a way she hadn't been when she was just a drowning victim. "Do you remember what happened? How you ended up in the river?" She opened her eyes again, and this time the tears did fall, sliding down her temples into her hair. "The wagon," she said. "We were crossing. The current was too strong. It pulled us. I remember falling. The water was so cold." "So dark Yates asked gently. Her face crumpled. "My brother, Thomas. He was driving." "Did you find him? Is he here?" Yates felt his chest tighten. He had found only her. "I'll search the river," he promised. "When you're stronger, we'll talk about it. Right now, you need to rest. You need to heal." But Rebecca was shaking her head, trying to push herself up. "I have to look for him. He might be hurt. He might need help." "Miss Osborne," Yates said firmly, pressing her shoulders gently back to the bed. She had no strength to resist. "You can barely lift your head. You were half dead when I found you. Another hour in that water and you would have been all the way dead. You're not going anywhere until you can stand without falling over." "But Thomas, I'll search," he interrupted. "I give you my word. As soon as I know you're stable, I'll walk every inch of the riverbank. But I won't leave you alone when you can barely breathe on your own." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war in her eyes, fear for her brother, recognition of her own helplessness. Finally, she closed her eyes again, fresh tears escaping. "He's all I have," she whispered. Yates had no answer to that. He had lost people too. He knew what those words meant. Instead, he said, "I'll make you something to eat. You need to get your strength back." He moved to the fire, putting together a thin broth from dried venison and wild onions he had stored. It wasn't much, but it would be easy on her stomach. While it heated, he glanced back at her. She had turned her face away from him toward the wall, and her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. Something in his chest ached at the sight. He wasn't used to comforting anyone. He had been alone so long that he had forgotten how to be around people, especially women. His life before the mountains felt like it belonged to someone else. But seeing her lying there, so broken and afraid, woke something in him that he thought he had left behind. When the broth was ready, he brought it to her. She had stopped crying, though her eyes were red and swollen. He helped her sit up this time, propping her against the log wall behind the bed, keeping blankets wrapped around her. She took the bowl in trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now, "for saving me, for this." "No need for thanks," Yates replied, settling back into his chair. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Not anyone. Some men would have left me there, or worse." He understood what she meant. The frontier was full of hard men, dangerous men. A woman alone was vulnerable in ways he rarely had to think about. "Well," he said, "I'm not some men." She studied him again, really looked at him, and he wondered what she saw. A wild man, probably, with his long hair and rough clothes, living alone in the mountains like some kind of hermit. Which, he supposed, was exactly what he was. "Why do you live out here?" she asked. So far from everything? It was a fair question, but not one he wanted to answer. "Long story," he said shortly. "You should eat. You need your strength." She took the hint and focused on the broth, sipping it slowly. He could see the effort it took her just to hold the bowl, to swallow. Whatever she had been through in that river had taken everything out of her. When she had drunk half of it, he took the bowl back. "That's enough for now. Don't want to make yourself sick. You can have more in a few hours." She nodded, already looking exhausted from just that small effort. He helped her lie back down, tucking the furs around her. "Sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch." "You must be tired too," she murmured, her eyes already drifting closed. I'm used to it, he said, which was true. In the mountains you learn to sleep light and wake at the smallest sound. A man who slept too deeply didn't last long. She was asleep within moments, her breathing evening out. Yates sat in his chair and watched her, this woman who had literally washed up at his doorstep. Rebecca Osborne. She was young, probably early 20s if he had to guess, with delicate features and dark hair that was drying into waves as the fire warmed the room. Even battered and bruised, there was something lovely about her, something that made him want to keep looking. He shook his head at himself. It had been too long since he had been around a woman, that was all. He was just lonely. That was natural. It didn't mean anything, but as the morning stretched into afternoon and he sat there watching over her sleep, Yates couldn't quite convince himself that was true. When Rebecca woke again, the light had changed, going golden the way it did in late afternoon. Yates was still in his chair, whittling a piece of wood, and she watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake. His hands were sure and steady as he worked, strong fingers guiding the knife with precision. There was something calming about watching him, something that made the panic in her chest ease just a little. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. He looked up, setting aside his whittling. "Few hours. How do you feel?" "Like I swallowed the river," she admitted, her voice still hoarse but clearer than before. "Everything hurts. That's normal. You took a beating from the water and the rocks. But nothing's broken that I can tell." She felt heat rise to her face as she realized what that meant. He must have checked her for injuries, must have seen her. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, even though she was already covered. "I had to get you out of your wet clothes," Yates said, as if reading her thoughts. "You were freezing." "I didn't look at anything I didn't need to see." "I understand," Rebecca said quietly. "Thank you for being respectful." He nodded once, then stood. "I'm going to go search for your brother now. Will you be all right here alone for a bit?" Fear flashed through her. Not fear of him leaving, but fear of what he might find. "Yes," she said anyway, because she needed to know. She had to know what happened to Thomas. Yates moved around the cabin, gathering supplies. He strapped on a gun belt she hadn't noticed before, checked a rifle, grabbed a canteen. Every movement was efficient, purposeful. This was a man who knew how to survive, who knew the dangers of the wilderness. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "There's water here and the fire's built up. Don't try to get up unless you absolutely have to. If you need to, there's a chamber pot under the bed." She felt her face heat again, but nodded. He paused at the door, looking back at her, and something passed between them. A connection, fragile and new, but real. "I'll find out what happened to him," Yates promised, one way or another. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, and Rebecca was alone. The cabin felt bigger without him in it, quieter. She looked around, really taking it in for the first time. It was simple but well made, with a solid roof and tight walls. There was a table, 2 chairs, shelves with supplies, his bed where she lay now, and the fireplace. On the walls hung furs and what looked like bearskin. His rifle rack held 2 more rifles besides the one he had taken. This was a man who lived by hunting, by his own skills. What was his story? Why did a man like him, strong and capable, hide away in the mountains alone? He couldn't be much older than 30, she guessed. Young enough that he should have a wife, a family, a life. But then, who was she to judge? She had been running too, in her own way. That's why she and Thomas had been on that wagon, trying to cross the river to get to the Montana territory. They had been heading to Silver Ridge, where Thomas had heard there was work in the mines, a chance to start over after everything had fallen apart back in Kansas. Kansas felt like a lifetime ago now. Their parents' farm, lost to debt after Pa died. The man their mother had married in desperation, who turned out to be cruel with his fists and crueler with his words. Thomas had finally had enough when that man raised a hand to Rebecca, and they had left in the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and what little money they had saved in secret. They were supposed to start over. They were supposed to be safe. Rebecca felt tears burning her eyes again and blinked them back furiously. She couldn't fall apart. Not yet. Not until she knew. Time passed slowly. The light shifted and faded. She dozed fitfully, waking each time with a start, disoriented. The cabin was growing darker when she finally heard footsteps outside. The door opened and Yates came in, and she knew from his face before he said anything. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I found him about 2 miles downstream. He didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt. Rebecca heard a sound, realized it was coming from her, a low keening that she couldn't stop. Yates was beside her in an instant, and without thinking, she reached for him. He caught her hands in his. Let her grip them with all the strength she had, which wasn't much. "Are you sure?" she managed. "Are you sure it was him?" He had papers in his pocket. Thomas Osborne, 23 years old, from Lawrence, Kansas. 23. He would never be 24. He would never see Montana, never work in those mines, never have the life he dreamed about in whispered conversations as they traveled. "What happened to him?" she asked, needing to know, dreading the answer. "He hit his head on the rocks, I think. It would have been quick. He didn't suffer." She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. "Where is he now?" "I found a good spot up on the ridge where the view is nice. I buried him proper, said some words. I can take you there when you're strong enough if you want." "I want," she whispered. "I need to say goodbye." "You will," Yates promised. He was still holding her hands, she realized. His were warm and rough and solid, anchoring her to this moment when everything felt like it was spinning away. "I'm alone now," she said, the reality crashing over her. "I have nothing, no family, no money. My clothes are ruined. I don't even know where I am." "You're here," Yates said firmly. "And you're alive. That's something, is it?" The words came out bitter. "Maybe I should have died in that river too." "No." His voice was sharp, and she looked up at him in surprise. His jaw was set, his dark eyes intense. "Don't say that. Don't even think it. You survived for a reason. Your brother would want you to live." "You don't know what he would want," she said, but there was no heat in it. "I know no one who loves someone wants them to give up," Yates countered. "And he loved you. That was clear from the way you talked about him." She closed her eyes and the tears came again, but quieter this time. Yates didn't let go of her hands. He sat there on the edge of the bed and let her cry, his presence solid and real when everything else felt like it was dissolving. When the tears finally slowed, she felt hollowed out, exhausted beyond measure. Yates gently released her hands and stood. "I'm going to make us something to eat," he said. "You need food in you." Grief takes a lot out of a person. She didn't argue. She watched as he moved around the cabin, building up the fire, preparing something in a pot. The domesticity of it was strange given the circumstances, but also oddly comforting. Life went on. Even when it felt like it shouldn't, it did. He brought her more broth, thicker this time, with actual pieces of meat and some wild vegetables. She ate slowly, mechanically, not tasting much of anything. He ate his own portion standing at the counter, watching her. "What am I going to do?" she asked finally, setting aside the bowl. "Right now you're going to heal," Yates said. "When you're strong enough to walk, we'll figure out the rest. I have nowhere to go, no one to go to." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You can stay here as long as you need. I have supplies enough for 2 through the summer, and I can hunt more. You'll be safe. I can't impose on you like that." "It's not imposing if I'm offering." He met her eyes. "Look, I know you don't know me. I know this is strange. But the nearest town is a hard day's ride, and you're in no shape for that. Stay until you're healed. Then we can talk about what comes next." It was the most sensible thing, but it still felt wrong somehow. A woman staying alone with a strange man in a cabin in the wilderness. It wasn't proper. It wasn't done, but then nothing about her life was proper anymore. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you. I'll try to help around here as I can, to earn my keep. Just focus on getting better," Yates said. "That's enough." He took her bowl away and cleaned up, then added more wood to the fire. Night had fallen fully now, the cabin lit only by firelight. Rebecca felt her eyelids growing heavy again. Her body was demanding rest, demanding time to heal. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, suddenly realizing she was in his bed. "I have furs. I'll make a bed roll on the floor." "I can't take your bed. You're injured. You need it more than I do." His tone left no room for argument. She watched as he pulled down furs from the wall and made himself a place near the fireplace. It looked comfortable enough, she supposed. He moved with practiced ease, like he had done this before. "Yates," she said as he was settling in. "Yeah? Thank you for everything, for saving me, for burying my brother, for being kind." He was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep, Rebecca." She closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of his breathing. Tomorrow she would grieve. Tomorrow she would face the reality of her situation. But tonight, wrapped in warm furs in a cabin in the mountains, with a stranger who had become her unlikely protector watching over her, she let herself rest. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Yates would wake first, build up the fire, and make coffee. The smell of it would wake Rebecca, and she would watch him move around the cabin from her place in the bed. He would bring her coffee and something to eat, usually leftover game from the night before, or Johnny cakes fried in a pan. At first, she could barely sit up on her own, and he would help her, careful not to touch more than necessary. But as the days passed, she grew stronger. A week after he had found her, she was able to stand and walk slowly around the cabin, holding onto furniture for support. Her bruises were fading from purple to green to yellow. Her lungs no longer hurt with every breath. Yates spent his days checking traps, hunting, and maintaining the cabin. He was gone for hours at a time, but he always made sure she had everything she needed before he left. And he always came back before dark, as if he feared what might happen if he didn't. They talked more as she healed. Small things at first. He taught her the names of the peaks she could see from the window. She told him about Kansas, about growing up on a farm, about Thomas and his dreams. Neither of them pushed for deeper stories. There was time for that, or there wasn't. Either way, they had an unspoken agreement to let things unfold naturally. 2 weeks after she washed up on his shore, Rebecca finally felt strong enough to visit Thomas's grave. Yates helped her dress in her traveling dress, which he had mended as best he could. It was still torn and stained, but it was wearable. She had no other choice anyway. The walk up to the ridge was hard. She had to stop several times to catch her breath, and Yates stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell. But she made it, and when she saw the cairn of stones he had built, the simple wooden cross he had fashioned, she felt her throat close up. "I carved his name," Yates said quietly, pointing to the cross. "Figured he should be remembered proper. Thomas Osborne." The letters were rough but clear. Rebecca knelt in the grass beside the grave, not caring that it soaked her skirt. Yates moved away, giving her privacy, but stayed close enough that she could see him. She didn't know what to say. She had never been good with words, not like Thomas, who could talk to anyone about anything. So she just sat there, feeling the mountain wind on her face, looking out at the view he would never see. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I tried to hold on, but the water was too strong. I'm sorry you'll never get to Montana, never get to start over. I'm sorry for everything." The wind was her only answer, but somehow it was enough. She stayed there for a long time, saying goodbye in her heart to the brother who had protected her, who had given up everything for her, who had died trying to build them a better life. When she finally stood, Yates was there, offering his arm. She took it gratefully, and they walked back to the cabin together in silence. That night she cried herself to sleep, but it was different than before. It was the crying of someone letting go, starting to accept. Yates sat in his chair by the fire, whittling, and occasionally she would hear him move, adding wood, checking the coffee pot, small sounds that reminded her she wasn't alone. As spring deepened into early summer, Rebecca grew stronger still. She started helping around the cabin, insisting despite Yates's protests. She cooked meals, mended his clothes with a sewing kit he found in a trunk, organized his supplies. It felt good to be useful, to have purpose beyond just healing. She learned things about him slowly. He had been a soldier once, during the war. Afterward, he had drifted west, trying to find something, though he never said what. He had been in these mountains 5 years, living alone, trading furs once a season in the nearest town for supplies he couldn't make or find himself. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her in the chair and him on the floor, his back against the log wall. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but people can be more lonely in a crowd than alone in the wilderness." She understood that. She had been lonely in Kansas too, even surrounded by people, lonely in her grief for her father, lonely in her fear of her stepfather, lonely in knowing that she and Thomas were on their own. "Why did you really come out here?" she pressed gently. "What are you running from?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "During the war, I did things. Things I'm not proud of. Things that haunt me. After it ended, I couldn't go back to normal life. Couldn't pretend like everything was fine when I could still see their faces, hear their screams. So I came out here, where there's no one to hurt, no one to disappoint." Rebecca felt her heart ache for him. "The war ended over a decade ago. You've been punishing yourself all this time?" "It's not punishment, it's penance." "There's a difference?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the pain in his dark eyes. "I don't know anymore." She wanted to say something profound, something healing, but she had no words that could fix what the war had broken. So instead she said, "You saved my life. Whatever you did back then, you've done good here. One life doesn't balance out many, maybe not. But it matters. It matters to me." Something shifted in his expression, softened. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Rebecca felt something flutter in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. She looked away first, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. This was dangerous territory. She was dependent on him, living in his cabin, under his protection. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for him. It would only complicate everything. But as the days continued to pass, she found it harder and harder to keep those feelings at bay. She noticed things about him she hadn't before. The way his hair fell across his face when he was concentrating on something. The rare smile that transformed his features from stern to almost boyish. The gentleness in his strong hands when he handled fragile things. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Something hungry and yearning in his eyes that made her breath catch. She was falling for him. She knew it was foolish, knew all the reasons it was a bad idea, but she couldn't seem to stop it. And she thought maybe, just maybe, he was falling for her too. It came to a head one evening in early June. They had spent the day picking wild strawberries, and she had made a simple cobbler with their meager supplies. They ate it warm by the fire, and she laughed at the way he closed his eyes in appreciation, like it was the best thing he had ever tasted. "You're easy to please," she teased. "I haven't had anything sweet in years," he said. "This is better than any fancy dessert in any restaurant back east. You're just saying that. I'm not." He looked at her, his expression serious. "You have no idea what you've brought to this place, Rebecca. Before you came, it was just existing. Now it feels like living." Her smile faded as she realized he was serious. "Yates, I know I shouldn't say it," he continued, setting his bowl aside. "I know you're only here because you have nowhere else to go. I know you'll leave as soon as you're able. But I need you to know that these weeks with you have been the best I've had since before the war." Rebecca's heart was pounding. "What if I don't want to leave?" He went very still. What if I don't want to leave?" she repeated, meeting his eyes. "What if I wanted to stay here, with you?" "Rebecca, you can't mean that. This is no life for a woman. It's hard and lonely, and—" "It's not lonely when there's two," she interrupted. "And I've done hard work my whole life. I'm not afraid of that. But what about your future? A husband, children, a real home? What if that's what I want? With you?" The words hung in the air between them. Yates looked stunned, like she had hit him with something. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know what you're saying. You're grateful, that's all. I saved your life, and you're confusing gratitude with something else." Rebecca stood too, moving closer to him. "Don't tell me what I feel. I know the difference between gratitude and this. I've been watching you for weeks. I see the way you look at me. I hear the way you say my name. And I feel something when I'm near you that I've never felt before. You're young. You haven't had the chance to meet anyone else. I'm 22 years old, not a child, and I've met plenty of other men. None of them made me feel the way you do." He was breathing hard now, staring at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "This is madness." "Maybe," she agreed, "but I've lost everything else. My parents, my home, my brother. I'm not going to lose this too because I was too afraid to say what I feel. And what do you feel?" His voice was rough, almost desperate. "I feel like I was drowning long before I fell in that river," she said quietly. "And you pulled me out of more than just the water. You made me want to live again. You made me feel safe. You made me feel like maybe, just maybe, there's still good in this world." She took a breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Yates, and I think you feel the same way." For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak. Then, with a sound that was half groan, half surrender, he closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. "God help me, I do," he said against her hair. "I think I've been falling for you since the moment I saw those amber eyes looking up at me. I tried to fight it. Tried to tell myself I was just lonely, that you would leave, that I had no right to feel this way. But I can't fight it anymore." Rebecca wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the rapid beating of his heart. "Then don't fight it, just let it be." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Then he was kissing her and she was kissing him back, and it felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. But when she pressed closer, her hands sliding up into his hair, he deepened it, and she felt the desperation behind it, the longing, the need. She felt it too, rising up inside her like a wave. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Because if you stay, if we do this, I'm never letting you go." "I'm sure," she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter. Then he picked her up like she weighed nothing, carrying her to the bed, and she laughed at the romantic gesture of it. "What?" he asked, a smile playing at his lips. "Nothing. I just never took you for the sweeping off her feet type. There's a lot you don't know about me yet, he said, laying her down gently on the furs. But I plan to spend a very long time showing you. I'm looking forward to it, she said, pulling him down to her. That night by the fire's glow, Rebecca and Yates came together in a way that was both desperate and tender, both healing and new. He was careful with her, mindful of her still healing body, but she could feel the passion beneath his restraint, the depth of feeling he had been holding back. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, his arm around her, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly into the darkness. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone in these mountains. And I thought I'd died in that river, Rebecca replied. Guess we were both wrong. Best mistake I ever made. She smiled against his skin. Mine too. They lay there in comfortable silence for a while, and then Rebecca said, we should probably get married. She felt him go still. What? Well, we're living together. We just, And I'm fairly certain if we keep doing that, there will be consequences. She felt her face heat even though she couldn't see her. My mother would roll over in her grave if she knew I was living in sin with a man. Yates was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, Are you proposing to me, Rebecca Osborne? I suppose I am, unless you want to do it properly. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her in the dim firelight. His expression was serious, but his eyes were warm. Rebecca, I don't have much to offer you. No fine house, no money, no easy life. But I can promise you I'll work hard every day to provide for you. I'll protect you with my life. I'll be faithful to you until I draw my last breath. And I'll love you with everything I have for as long as I live. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Will you marry me? Tears pricked at Rebecca's eyes, but they were happy tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, sealing the promise, and Rebecca felt something settle in her chest. A sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never felt before. The next morning, they began planning. The nearest town was Snowy Creek, about 40 miles south through rough terrain. They would need to make the journey to find a preacher and make their union legal. Yates wanted to wait a bit longer, to make sure Rebecca was strong enough for the trip, but she insisted they go within the week. I'm strong enough, she said firmly, and the sooner we're properly married, the better I'll feel. He relented, though she could see the concern in his eyes. He spent the next few days preparing for the journey, making sure his horses were ready, packing supplies, ensuring the cabin would be secure in their absence. Rebecca, for her part, worked on her appearance. Her dress was still a disaster, torn and stained beyond real repair, despite his efforts. She did her best with it, but she knew she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had nearly drowned and been living rough in the mountains. I look terrible, she said the morning they were set to leave, staring at herself in the small mirror Yates had. Her hair was wild, her face sun-darkened, her dress a mess. You look beautiful, Yates said from behind her, and she could hear he meant it. You're biased. Damn right I am. He turned her around to face him. You ready for this? More than ready. They set out in the early morning light. Yates had 2 horses, sturdy mountain-bred animals that could handle the terrain. He put Rebecca on the gentler of the 2, a mare named Sage, while he rode a big gelding called Bear. They traveled slowly, Yates keeping a careful eye on Rebecca to make sure she wasn't overtaxing herself. The journey took all day. They followed a trail that wound through the mountains, crossing streams and climbing slopes, moving steadily south. Rebecca was exhausted by the time Snowy Creek came into view in the late afternoon, but she didn't complain. She had meant what she said. She was strong enough. Snowy Creek was a typical frontier town, a muddy main street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a hotel, and a small church. People stared as they rode through. Curious about the rough mountain man and the bedraggled woman with him, they went straight to the church. The preacher was an older man named Reverend Hall, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He took one look at them and seemed to understand the situation immediately. You want to be married, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, Yates said, as soon as possible. Reverend Hall looked at Rebecca. Is this your wish, young lady? No one is forcing you. It's my wish, Rebecca said firmly. I love him, and I want to be his wife. The Reverend, well then, I see no reason to wait. Do you have witnesses? They didn't, but Reverend Hall called in his wife and the church caretaker. The ceremony was short and simple, no frills or fuss, but it didn't matter. When Yates slipped a simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger, a ring he said had been his mother's, she felt her eyes fill with tears. When Reverend Hall said, You may kiss your bride, Yates did so with such tenderness that Rebecca felt her heart might burst. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding. Rebecca Nolan. She tried out the name in her head and loved the sound of it. "Thank you, Reverend," Yates said, shaking the man's hand. "God bless you both," Reverend Hall replied. "Come back and visit us sometime. Let us know how you're faring." "We will," Rebecca promised, though she suspected it would be a long while before they made this journey again. They spent that night in the hotel, a luxury after weeks in the cabin. Yates bought her a new dress from the general store, simple but clean and whole, and she felt almost human again. They had a proper meal in the hotel dining room, and people continued to stare, but Rebecca didn't care. She was married. She was a wife. She belonged to Yates, and he belonged to her. That night in the hotel room they made love again, and it was different than the first time. There was no hesitation now, no question about whether this was right. They were husband and wife, bound together by law and love and choice. "Mrs. Nolan," Yates murmured against her skin, and she shivered at the sound of it. "Say it again," she whispered. "Mrs. Nolan, my wife." "Mine, yours," she agreed, "always yours." They left Snowy Creek the next morning, heading back into the mountains. The journey back felt shorter somehow, or maybe Rebecca was just eager to get home. Home, that's what the cabin was now. Not just Yates's cabin, but their cabin. Their home. Over the summer, they settled into married life. Rebecca learned to shoot, to trap, to read the signs of the forest. Yates taught her everything he knew about surviving in the mountains, and she proved to be a quick student. She also brought civilization to the cabin in small ways. Curtains made from spare fabric, wildflowers in a cup on the table, songs hummed while she cooked. Yates seemed to thrive on her presence. He smiled more, laughed more, talked more. The haunted look that had lived in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something lighter, happier. They talked about the future sometimes, lying in bed at night. Whether they would stay in the mountains forever or eventually move to a town, whether they wanted children, what they would name them if they did. "I'd like a big family," Rebecca admitted one night. "Brothers and sisters for our kids to grow up with so they're never alone like I am now." "I'd like that too," Yates said, pulling her closer. "Fill this cabin with noise and chaos." "We might need a bigger cabin," she pointed out. "Then I'll build one. Whatever you need, I'll provide." She believed him. In the months since he had pulled her from the river, he had proven himself time and again. He was a man of his word, solid and steady and true. By late summer, Rebecca's suspicions were confirmed when she missed her monthly courses for the second time. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Yates, when she told him, looked stunned for a moment, then broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen on his face. "A baby," he said, his hand going to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," he said, kissing her soundly. "You've given me everything, Rebecca. Everything." As autumn came and the leaves turned gold, Yates began preparing for winter in earnest. He hunted and smoked meat, stored vegetables, checked and rechecked the cabin to make sure it would hold against the mountain storms. He was worried about Rebecca being pregnant through the winter, worried about what would happen when her time came with no doctor nearby. "Women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time," Rebecca reminded him. "We'll be fine." "But what if something goes wrong?" "Then you'll handle it," she said firmly. "You're the most capable man I've ever known. I trust you." Her faith in him seemed to calm his fears at least a little. He started reading through an old medical book he had buried in his trunk, studying the sections on childbirth with the same intensity he had once brought to learning survival skills. Winter came early that year, snow falling in October and not letting up. They were snowed in by November, the world beyond the cabin reduced to white silence. But inside, they were warm and safe, the fire always burning, plenty of food stored away. Rebecca's belly grew as the winter deepened. By December, she could no longer see her feet. By January, she was moving slowly, her back aching, her body preparing for what was to come. Yates was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly asking if she was all right, if she needed anything, if she should rest more. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said with exasperation one day when he tried to stop her from sweeping the floor. "I know, I just worry, I know you do, but you need to trust that I know my own body." He relented, but she caught him watching her constantly, as if he could prevent something bad from happening through sheer force of will. The baby came in early February, during a blizzard that howled around the cabin. Rebecca's labor started in the morning, slow contractions that gradually grew closer together. By evening, she was in serious pain, and by midnight she was pushing. Yates stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her. "You can do this," he said over and over. "You're the strongest person I know." And she did. Just before dawn, with one final push that took everything she had, their son came into the world. Yates caught him, cut the cord with shaking hands, and wrapped him in a clean blanket. The baby let out a lusty cry, and Rebecca started laughing and crying at the same time. "A boy," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son." He placed the baby in her arms, and Rebecca looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fists waving. Love flooded through her so strongly she could barely breathe. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." Yates sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around her shoulders, looking at their son with wonder. "What should we name him?" Rebecca thought of her brother buried on the ridge above the cabin, Thomas, who had died trying to give her a better life. Thomas, who would never know that his sacrifice had led to this. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Yates Nolan." Yates looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "It's perfect," he said softly. "He would be honored." They sat there together as the blizzard raged outside, the three of them in their own small world, safe and warm and together. Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her here, the river that had tried to kill her, the brother she had lost, the mountain man who had saved her, the love that had grown between them. She had washed ashore, half drowned at his cabin, more dead than alive, and he had carried her in and never left her side. He had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Thank you," she said to Yates, looking up at him. "For what?" "For pulling me out of that river, for taking care of me, for loving me, for this." She looked down at their son. "For everything. You don't have to thank me for loving you," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "It's the easiest thing I've ever done." Little Thomas was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them busy through the rest of the winter. There were sleepless nights and exhausting days, but there was also more joy than Rebecca had ever imagined. Watching Yates with their son, seeing the gentleness in his strong hands as he held the tiny body, hearing him sing rough lullabies in his deep voice, filled her heart to bursting. When spring finally came and the snow melted, they took Thomas up to the ridge to visit his namesake's grave. Rebecca knelt in the grass, her son in her arms, and told her brother about everything that had happened. "You'd like him," she said of Yates. "He's a good man. He takes care of us. And this little one, he's beautiful. He has your nose, I think. I wish you could meet him. I wish you could have seen how things turned out." She paused, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I miss you every day, but I'm happy. I hope wherever you are, you know that. I'm happy." Yates stood nearby, giving her space for her grief and her memories. When she was ready, he helped her up, and they walked back to the cabin together, their son between them. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter came 2 years after Thomas, and they named her Elizabeth. Then another son, James, and then another daughter, Sarah. The cabin grew too, with Yates adding rooms as needed, expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. Life in the mountains was hard, but it was good. The children grew up strong and capable, learning the ways of the wilderness from their father, learning reading and figures and music from their mother. They were a tight-knit family, bound together by love and necessity. Sometimes traders or trappers would pass through and be shocked to find a family thriving so far from civilization. Rebecca would just smile and offer them coffee, and Yates would trade furs for supplies and news from the outside world. They heard about the changes happening in the territories, about towns growing into cities, about railroads crossing the country. The world was moving on, becoming more modern, more connected. But up in their mountains, time seemed to move differently. Slower. "Steadyr, do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked Yates one evening when the children were asleep and they sat by the fire like they had in those early days. "Staying out here? Not going back to civilization?" "Not once," he said without hesitation. "This is where I belong, with you, with them. This is my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, even though it's hard, especially because it's hard. The things worth having are worth working for." He pulled her close. "You taught me that." "I think you taught me that," she countered. Then we taught each other. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, content in each other's presence. After all these years, Rebecca still marveled sometimes at how her life had turned out. She had lost everything in that river, but she had gained so much more. When Thomas grew old enough to understand, they told him about his uncle, about the journey that had brought his parents together. He listened with wide eyes, and then insisted on visiting the grave on the ridge. It became a tradition in their family, going up to the ridge each spring to pay respects, to remember. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" Thomas asked one year when he was about 10. "I know he would," Rebecca said, ruffling his hair. "You're named after a good man who loved his family. You carry that forward." As the children grew into teenagers and then young adults, they began to think about their own futures. Thomas wanted to explore the territories, to see what was beyond their mountains. Elizabeth dreamed of teaching, of starting a school in one of the growing towns. James was content to stay and live the mountain life like his father. Sarah was still young enough that her dreams changed with the seasons. Rebecca and Yates talked about what would happen when the children left, as children do. The cabin would feel empty, quiet, but they would still have each other, and after all these years, that was still more than enough. One evening in the summer when Thomas was 18 and talking about leaving for Montana Territory, Yates took Rebecca up to the ridge to watch the sunset. They sat on the grass near the grave, looking out over the valley below, painted gold and purple by the fading light. 20 years, Yates said quietly. 20 years since I found you in that river. Has it really been that long? Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, still fitting perfectly against him. It feels like yesterday and forever all at once. I was just existing before you, he said. Going through the motions, you gave me a reason to live again. You did the same for me. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. We saved each other. I think that brother of yours might have had a hand in it, Yates said, nodding toward the grave. Sending you to me, making sure you'd be taken care of. Maybe, Rebecca said softly. Thomas always did look out for me. They sat there as the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire. Below them, the cabin chimney was smoking, their children preparing dinner, their life, their family, everything they had built together. No regrets? Yates asked, echoing her question from years ago. Not a single one, Rebecca said. You? Only that I didn't find you sooner. She smiled and kissed him, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and devotion. When they pulled apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Come on, Rebecca said, standing and pulling him up. Let's go home. They walked down the ridge together, hand in hand, back to the cabin full of light and laughter, back to the life they had built from tragedy and chance and love. Behind them, the grave on the ridge stood silent vigil, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. Thomas, the young man they had named in honor of Rebecca's brother, left for Montana Territory that fall. It was hard to watch him go, but Rebecca knew it was necessary. He needed to find his own path, just as she and his Uncle Thomas had tried to do all those years ago. The difference was, her Thomas would come back. He had a home to return to, a family waiting for him. Elizabeth left 2 years later to teach in a growing town called Silver Ridge. Ironically, the same place Rebecca and her brother had been heading when the river took him. Life had a strange way of coming full circle. James stayed, as he had always planned, learning everything he could from Yates about living in the mountains. He brought home a wife when he was 23, a sturdy frontier girl named Martha, who took to mountain life like she had been born to it. They built their own cabin nearby, and Rebecca delighted in watching her son become a husband and eventually a father. Sarah the baby surprised them all by becoming a healer. She learned from books Yates ordered special from back east, and from trial and error, and from instinct. People started coming from miles around when they were sick or injured, seeking out Sarah Nolan and her gentle hands. Rebecca and Yates grew older, but they grew older together. His hair went silver, then white. Her hands became spotted with age, but they still loved each other with the same intensity as those early days, maybe even more. Deepened by decades of partnership, they became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The cabin on the ridge became known throughout the territory as a place of safety, of healing, of hospitality. Rebecca would never turn away anyone who needed help, remembering how Yates had taken her in when she had nothing. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin. All 4 children, their spouses, a dozen grandchildren running wild through the mountains. They had a feast, told stories, laughed until their sides hurt. That night, when everyone else was asleep in bedrolls and makeshift beds scattered throughout the expanded cabin, Rebecca and Yates slipped outside. They walked up to the ridge in the moonlight, to the grave that had been part of their story from the beginning. Thank you, Rebecca said to the stone, to her brother, to the universe. Thank you for sending me to him. Thank you for the life I've had. Yates wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood there together, looking out at the silver-lit mountains. at the cabin below full of the family they had created. "I love you," he murmured into her hair, "every day for 30 years, and I'll love you every day until I die, and beyond," Rebecca added. "Love like ours doesn't end." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." They were in their 60s when Yates got sick. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then weakness, then pain. Sarah did everything she could, but some things couldn't be healed. Rebecca nursed him through it, rarely leaving his side, just as he had never left hers all those years ago when he pulled her from the river. "I'm not ready to let you go," she told him one night when they both knew the end was near. "I know," he said, his voice weak but steady. "I'm not ready either. But Rebecca, you gave me the best years of my life. You gave me everything. I got to love you, to build a life with you, to see our children grow. That's more than I ever deserved." "You deserved all of it and more," she said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You were the best man I ever knew." He smiled at her, that same smile that had warmed her heart for decades. "And you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Even if it meant losing you now, I'd do it all again, every moment." He died 2 days later, in the bed where they had slept together for 35 years, with Rebecca holding his hand and their children surrounding them. His last word was her name. The grief was crushing. Rebecca felt like she was drowning again, like she was back in that river gasping for air, but this time there was no strong man to pull her out. She had to find her way through on her own. They buried him on the ridge, next to Thomas Osborne's grave. It felt right somehow. The two men who had shaped her life resting side by side, watching over the valley. Rebecca lived for 7 more years after Yates died. They were lonely years in some ways, but full in others. She was surrounded by family, by love, by the legacy they had built together. She taught her grandchildren to read, told them stories about their grandfather, about the mountain man who had saved a drowning woman and ended up saving himself. She never remarried. The question came up occasionally, but she always refused. "I had my love," she would say. "One great love is more than most people get. I won't diminish it by settling for less." When her time came, it was peaceful. She simply went to sleep one winter night and didn't wake up. Sarah found her in the morning, a slight smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in her dreams. They buried her next to Yates, as she had requested. On one side, her husband, on the other, her brother. The 3 of them together on the ridge, overlooking the valley, the river, the cabin that had been the site of so much life and love. Thomas, the eldest son, now an old man himself with silver in his hair and grandchildren of his own, stood at his mother's grave and told the story one more time. The story that had become legend in their family, about the river and the drowning and the mountain man who never left her side. She used to say she died in that river, Thomas told his grandchildren, and in a way she did. The girl she was died, and the woman she became was born into a love that lasted a lifetime, born into a family that spread across these mountains, born into a story that we'll keep telling for generations. He placed a wildflower on the grave, the kind his mother had loved to pick in the summer. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything you gave us, for the love you showed us, for teaching us what it means to be family." The wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, the Snake River continued its eternal journey through the mountains, carrying water and stories and memories, always flowing, always changing, always constant. Years turned into decades, and decades into a century. The cabin on the ridge remained in the family, passed down from generation to generation. The story of Rebecca and Yates became the foundation story, the legend that every child learned. About the woman who washed ashore half drowned, and the mountain man who carried her in and never left her side, and the love that grew from tragedy and chance and choice. The 3 graves on the ridge became a pilgrimage site for the family. Every spring, whoever was living in the cabin would clean the stones, plant flowers, tell the story again. Thomas Osborne, who had tried to save his sister, Yates Nolan, who had succeeded, and Rebecca Nolan, who had saved them both in the ways that mattered most, because in the end, that's what the story was really about. Not just rescue from drowning, but rescue from loneliness, from grief, from despair. It was about 2 broken people who found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful. It was about love that transcended circumstances, about family that endured, about legacy that lasted. The Snake River still flows through those Wyoming mountains, cold and clear and dangerous. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises from the water, you can almost see them. A woman with amber eyes and a mountain man with gentle hands, walking together along the riverbank, their love story written in the stones and the trees and the very bones of the mountains themselves. And high on the ridge, three graves stand in silent testimony to the truth that has echoed through the generations since, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best, that love can grow in the unlikeliest places, and that when someone carries you in and never leaves your side, they don't just save your life, they become your life, woven so tightly into your story that you can never separate one from the other. This is the story of Rebecca and Yates. This is the story of the woman who washed ashore and the mountain man who saved her. This is the story of a love that began with a drowning and ended only when both their earthly journeys were complete, continuing on in the lives they created, the family they built, and the legend that will live as long as there are mountains to hold it and rivers to carry it forward. And somewhere in the eternal flow of time and memory, they are together still, walking the ridge at sunset, looking out over the valley they loved, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one forever and always, saved and saving, loving and beloved, home at last in each other's arms where they always belonged.